Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet wander through the pages of history. Tonight, we'll be exploring a forgotten chapter of ancient life, one that still echoes softly through time. Whether you're settling in with a warm drink or already wrapped in blankets, thank you for letting my voice keep you company tonight. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time of day is it for you? Are you hearing this as the sun rises, or are you, like me, surrounded by the hush of nighttime? If the idea of gentle stories from long ago helps ease your mind, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting for us just beyond the veil of sleep. Picture this: secret societies meeting in abandoned abbeys, aristocrats hosting orgies at gatherings, and the social elite engaging in writ would make modern party scenes look like church walls so scandalous that even today, historians debate whether to publish the full details. This wasn't just rebellion. This was systematic debauchery, elevated to an art form. I'm talking about the Libertines of Georgian England, a shadowy network of nobles, politicians, and wealthy merchants who turned vice into their religion and excess into their creed. These weren't just your average party animals. These were the people who controlled Parliament, owned vast estates, and shaped the very fabric of British society. And behind closed doors, they were creating a culture of hedonism that would shock even our modern sensibilities. In this video, I'm going to take you deep into this hidden world of Georgian debauchery. We'll explore how elite society transformed from rigid moral codes into something resembling ancient Roman orgies. I'll reveal the secret clubs that operated like sexual cults, the masquerade balls that served as hunting grounds for the powerful, and the private gatherings where anything, and I mean anything, was considered acceptable entertainment. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. This wasn't just about wealthy people behaving badly. This culture of elite libertinism actually shaped politics, literature, art, and even the very concept of personal freedom that we take for granted today. The same people attending these scandalous gatherings were writing the laws, funding the arts, and influencing everything from fashion to philosophy. What you're about to discover goes far beyond simple historical gossip. This is the untold story of how a small group of privileged individuals created an entire subculture that operated parallel to respectable society, complete with its own rules, rituals, and revolutionary ideas about human nature itself. And trust me, by the end of this series, you'll understand why these libertines weren't just hedonistic partygoers. They were pioneers of a sexual and social revolution that would eventually transform the entire Western world. So let's start at the beginning, in the coffee houses and gentlemen's clubs of early 18th century London, where respectable society first began to crack at its perfectly polished seams. The year was 1714, and King George I had just ascended to the British throne. London was experiencing unprecedented wealth and growth, but beneath the surface of Georgian respectability, something far more interesting was brewing. The rigid moral codes that had defined English society for centuries were starting to feel suffocating to those with enough money and power to ignore them. See, here's what most people don't realize about Georgian England. While the middle classes were becoming increasingly pious and morally rigid, the aristocracy was moving in the complete opposite direction. They had money, they had time, and most importantly, they had immunity from the consequences that would destroy ordinary citizens. This created the perfect storm for what historians now call the Libertine movement. But calling it a movement almost makes it sound organized and political. It wasn't. This was something far more organic and dangerous, a gradual abandonment of moral restraint by people who had never really faced moral consequences in the first place. The transformation began in London's gentlemen's clubs, places like White's, established in 1693, and the Kit Kat Club, founded around 1696, started as respectable meeting places for wealthy men to discuss politics and literature. But as the decades progressed, these clubs became laboratories for pushing social boundaries. Take the Kit Kat Club, for example. What started as literary discussions over mutton pies quickly evolved into something far more provocative. Members began bringing actresses and courtesans to their meetings. Wine flowed freely, and conversations that would have been scandalous in mixed company became commonplace. The club's members included some of the most powerful men in England: dukes, earls, members of parliament, and wealthy merchants who controlled London's growing financial empire. But here's where it gets really interesting. These men weren't just indulging in simple pleasures. They were developing an entire philosophy around their behavior. They began to see traditional morality as a constraint designed to control the masses, something that enlightened individuals like themselves should transcend. This philosophical justification became crucial to understanding the libertine culture. It wasn't enough to simply break rules. They needed to believe they were superior to those rules. They borrowed ideas from French philosophers, classical Roman writers, and even early Enlightenment thinkers to create an intellectual framework for their hedonism. The French influence was particularly strong. Many English aristocrats had spent time in Paris, where salon culture allowed for much more open discussions about sexuality and morality. They brought back not just ideas, but actual practices. The art of seduction elevated to intellectual discourse, the concept of pleasure as a legitimate philosophical pursuit, and the notion that sexual freedom was a mark of sophistication rather than moral decay. But the real catalyst for Georgian libertinism came from an unexpected source: the theatre. During this period, London's theatre scene was exploding with new venues, new plays, and most importantly, new actresses. For the first time in English history, women were performing on stage professionally, and these actresses occupied a unique social position that made them perfect partners for aristocratic experimentation. Actresses existed in a social grey area. They were neither respectable middle-class women nor traditional courtesans. They were educated, often witty and sophisticated, but they also lived outside conventional social structures. This made them ideal companions for men who wanted intelligent conversation along with sexual adventure. The relationship between aristocratic men and theatrical women became the foundation for much of what would follow. These weren't just casual encounters. They were often long-term arrangements that resembled alternative marriages. Wealthy men would set up actresses in elegant apartments, attend their performances, and include them in social gatherings that would have been impossible with respectable wives present. This created a parallel social world where different rules applied. In respectable society, interactions between men and women were heavily regulated, conversations were carefully monitored, and physical intimacy was confined to marriage. But in this theatrical world, everything was negotiable. The most famous example was the relationship between Charles Churchill, a satirical poet and clergyman, and multiple actresses simultaneously. Churchill didn't hide these relationships. He celebrated them in his poetry, turning his sexual adventures into literary achievements. This wasn't seen as scandalous among his peers. It was seen as sophisticated. This acceptance of alternative relationships gradually expanded beyond the theatre world. Aristocratic women, initially shocked by their husbands' open affairs, began to develop their own networks of intimate friendships and romantic relationships. The concept of marriage as an exclusive emotional and physical bond started to seem quaint and restrictive to the social elite. By the 1730s, what had started as individual rebellion was becoming systematic. Private parties began featuring entertainment that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Masquerade balls, imported from Venice, became particularly popular because they allowed people to engage in behavior they could later deny or dismiss as playful anonymity. These masquerades weren't the innocent costume parties you might imagine. The anonymity provided by masks and elaborate costumes created an atmosphere where normal social barriers completely dissolved. Married women could flirt openly with men who weren't their husbands. respectable gentlemen could pursue adventures with women they would never acknowledge in daylight. Class distinctions became temporarily meaningless when everyone was disguised. The Haymarket Opera House became ground zero for these masked encounters. On masquerade nights, the Opera House would transform into something resembling a marketplace of desire, where social position, marital status, and even gender could become fluid and negotiable. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that sound more like elaborate sexual theatre than social dancing. But the masquerades were just the beginning. As the Georgian period progressed, private gatherings became increasingly elaborate and transgressive. Wealthy individuals began hosting themed parties that pushed boundaries even further. Roman-themed orgies, complete with classical costumes and ancient rituals, became fashionable among certain circles. These weren't random acts of rebellion. They were carefully orchestrated events that required significant planning, expense, and social coordination. Hosts would spend months preparing, importing exotic foods, commissioning special costumes, and carefully selecting guest lists that balanced discretion with adventure. The most sophisticated hosts understood that successful libertine gatherings required more than just removing moral constraints. They needed to create alternative structures that made transgression feel natural and even elevated. This led to the development of elaborate rituals, secret ceremonies, and coded language that transformed simple hedonism into something that felt almost religious in its intensity. And this is where our story takes its most fascinating turn, because these private experiments in alternative morality were about to evolve into something far more organized and influential. The scattered network of individual libertines was about to coalesce into actual societies, complete with membership rolls, meeting places, and formal rituals that would make their earlier adventures look like innocent games. The most famous of these societies would become known as the Hellfire Club, but that name actually covered multiple organizations that shared similar approaches to organized transgression. And their influence on Georgian society, politics, and culture would extend far beyond their private meeting rooms into the very heart of British power. The transformation from individual transgression to organized societies didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual evolution that began with something as simple as wealthy men wanting to make their adventures more predictable and exclusive. By the 1740s, the scattered network of libertine aristocrats had begun to realize that their individual pursuits would be far more satisfying if they could coordinate their efforts. This coordination started with practical considerations. Hosting elaborate private parties required enormous expense and risk. A single scandal could destroy a reputation, even for the wealthy. But if multiple aristocrats pooled their resources and shared the risks, they could create experiences that no individual could achieve alone. The first step was establishing regular meeting places. Rather than rotating between different private homes, groups began securing permanent venues where they could store costumes, wines, and the various props needed for their increasingly theatrical gatherings. Abandoned monasteries became particularly popular choices. These buildings offered several advantages. They were isolated from public view. They had large spaces suitable for group activities, and there was something deliciously ironic about using former religious sites for decidedly irreligious purposes. The most ambitious groups went further, actually purchasing or leasing these properties and renovating them specifically for their needs. They installed special chambers, decorated with classical motifs that celebrated sensual pleasure rather than spiritual devotion. Roman and Greek imagery became dominant. Statues of Bacchus, frescoes depicting mythological orgies, and inscriptions in Latin that celebrated physical indulgence over moral restraint. But securing permanent venues was just the beginning. The real innovation came in developing membership systems that balanced exclusivity with recruitment. These weren't open societies that anyone could join. Membership required not just wealth, but demonstrated commitment to the libertine philosophy, and most importantly, absolute discretion. The selection process became elaborate and ritualistic. Potential members would be observed for months or even years before being approached. Their behaviour at masquerade balls would be noted, their conversations at gentlemen's clubs would be monitored, and their relationships with actresses and courtesans would be evaluated. Only those who demonstrated both appetite for transgression and capability for secrecy would be considered. Once identified, potential recruits would be invited to increasingly exclusive gatherings. These weren't the full libertine ceremonies yet, but rather testing grounds where candidates could prove their worthiness. A man might be invited to a private dinner, where the entertainment included erotic poetry readings, or where the female guests were clearly not respectable wives. His reaction would determine whether he received further invitations. This careful vetting process created a network of men who shared not just similar interests, but similar values about discretion, loyalty, and the superiority of enlightened pleasure over conventional morality. They developed their own language, their own customs, and their own loyalty structures that often superseded their obligations to family or country. The societies that emerged from this process were unlike anything that had existed before in English history. They combined the exclusivity of aristocratic clubs with the intensity of religious orders and the transgression of criminal organizations. Members took oaths of secrecy that were enforced through social and sometimes economic consequences. Breaking these oaths didn't just mean expulsion, it could mean complete social destruction. The ritual aspects became increasingly elaborate as the societies matured. Simple dinner parties evolved into complex ceremonies that borrowed elements from classical mystery religions, medieval court traditions, and contemporary Masonic practices. Members would adopt classical names, wear special robes or costumes, and participate in formal procedures that transform their gatherings into something approaching religious observance. But here's what made these societies truly revolutionary. They weren't just about sexual adventure. They became laboratories for exploring alternative approaches to power, hierarchy, and social organization. Within these closed communities, traditional English class structures were often suspended or inverted. A wealthy merchant might hold higher status than a duke if he demonstrated greater commitment to libertine principles or showed more creativity in organizing pleasurable experiences. This experimentation with social hierarchy extended to their treatment of women. While Georgian societies severely restricted women's freedom and autonomy, libertine societies often granted female participants significantly more agency and power. Women who joined these circles could express desires and preferences that would be impossible in conventional society. Some even took leadership roles in organizing events or recruiting new members. The most sophisticated societies developed complex internal economies based on pleasure rather than money. Members would contribute different resources. Some provided venues, others supplied entertainment. Still others brought new participants or exotic materials for their ceremonies. Status within these groups depended more on imagination and commitment than on inherited wealth or traditional social position. This created a parallel aristocracy based entirely on libertine achievement. Men who might be relatively minor figures in conventional society could become influential leaders within these circles if they demonstrated particular skill at organizing transgressive experiences or maintaining group secrecy. Conversely, men with enormous conventional power might find themselves as mere followers if they lacked imagination or commitment to libertine principles. The societies also developed their own intellectual culture. Meetings would often include philosophical discussions about the nature of pleasure, the arbitrary character of moral rules, and the responsibility of enlightened individuals to transcend conventional limitations. Members would share books, particularly classical texts that celebrated sensual pleasure, and contemporary French works that challenged traditional English moral assumptions. These intellectual discussions weren't just pretentious justifications for hedonistic behavior. They represented genuine attempts to develop alternative moral frameworks that could guide their actions and give meaning to their transgression. Many members were highly educated men who had studied at Oxford or Cambridge, travelled extensively in Europe, and absorbed Enlightenment ideas about individual freedom and social progress. The combination of intellectual sophistication and systematic transgression created something unprecedented in English culture. These weren't just wealthy men behaving badly. They were creating alternative communities with their own values, customs, and standards of achievement. They saw themselves as pioneers exploring territories of human experience that conventional society was too timid or ignorant to investigate. By the 1750s, the most established societies had developed elaborate annual calendars of activities. Spring gatherings might focus on classical themes, with participants dressed as Roman senators or Greek philosophers. Summer events could be pastoral, taking advantage of country estates and outdoor settings for more naturalistic celebrations. Autumn ceremonies might emphasize harvest themes, with emphasis on abundance and gratitude for pleasure received. Winter gatherings became the most intense, with indoor settings allowing for the most elaborate staging and most transgressive activities. The seasonal structure created anticipation and rhythm that kept members engaged throughout the year. Participants would spend months preparing for specific events, commissioning costumes, planning entertainment, or recruiting new female companions. The societies became central organizing principles in many members' lives, more important than their official careers or family obligations. This level of organization required increasingly sophisticated leadership structures. The most successful societies developed hierarchies that balanced democratic participation with effective decision-making. Senior members would form councils that planned major events, managed finances, and handled disciplinary issues. Junior members would serve apprenticeships where they learned the customs and proved their commitment before gaining full privileges. The leadership roles weren't just ceremonial positions. They required real skills in organization, diplomacy, and risk management. A successful Libertine leader needed to coordinate complex events involving dozens of participants, maintain absolute secrecy among people who were often political rivals in conventional society, and navigate the constant tension between pushing boundaries and avoiding scandal. These organizational innovations would prove to be the society's greatest strength and their ultimate vulnerability. The more sophisticated they became, the more influence they wielded over their members' lives, and the more attractive they became to ambitious individuals who saw them as paths to alternative forms of power and status. But this growing sophistication also attracted attention from unexpected quarters. As these societies became more organized and influential, they began drawing interest from individuals whose motivations went far beyond simple pleasure-seeking. Politicians saw opportunities to build alternative power networks. Intellectuals viewed them as laboratories for social experimentation, and ambitious social climbers recognized them as potential shortcuts to influence among the elite. The influx of these more calculating participants fundamentally changed the character of Libertine societies. What had begun as genuine rebellion against moral constraint increasingly became strategic networking disguised as transgression. Members began using their society connections to advance business interests, political careers, and social ambitions that had nothing to do with Libertine philosophy. This transformation was most visible in the changing composition of society membership. The original Libertines had been primarily aristocrats with inherited wealth and established social positions who could afford to indulge in pure experimentation. But by the 1760s, membership increasingly included merchants, lawyers, politicians, and even clergymen who saw Libertine societies as alternative routes to aristocratic circles they couldn't otherwise access. The entry of professional classes brought new dynamics and tensions. These men often lacked the casual attitude towards scandal that characterized hereditary aristocrats. They needed their reputations for their careers, which made them simultaneously more cautious about exposure and more desperate to prove their commitment to transgressive principles. This created internal conflicts between members who viewed libertinism as natural expression of aristocratic superiority, and those who saw it as performance necessary for social advancement. The societies adapted to these tensions by developing increasingly complex internal hierarchies that separated genuine libertines from strategic participants. Core members, typically the hereditary aristocrats who had founded specific societies, maintained control over the most transgressive activities, while allowing newer members access to more moderate gatherings that still provided valuable networking opportunities. This stratification created multiple levels of participation within individual societies. Outer circles might engage in activities that were merely unconventional by Georgian standards. Mixed-gender dinner parties with risque entertainment, gambling sessions that included women, or masquerade events with suggestive but not explicitly sexual themes. Inner circles reserved the most transgressive activities for members who had proven both their commitment and their discretion over extended periods. The most exclusive activities took place in specially designed chambers within society properties that only senior members could access. These spaces were decorated with increasingly elaborate and explicit imagery, furnished with objects designed specifically for group sexual activities, and equipped with features that facilitated the complex ceremonies that had evolved over decades of experimentation. Contemporary accounts, though necessarily fragmentary due to the secrecy involved, suggest that these inner circle gatherings had evolved into elaborate theatrical productions that combined elements of classical mystery religions with innovative sexual practices. Participants would assume mythological personas, engage in ritualistic preparations that might last for hours, and participate in ceremonies that were simultaneously spiritual and sensual. The theatrical aspect became increasingly important as societies matured. Simple sexual encounters, no matter how transgressive, could become routine over time. To maintain intensity and member interest, society leaders needed to constantly innovate and escalate. This drove them toward increasingly elaborate productions that required significant artistic and logistical sophistication. Professional artists, musicians, and even architects were secretly commissioned to contribute to these productions. Painters would create special backdrops and decorative elements. Composers would write music specifically for society ceremonies, and craftsmen would construct specialized furniture and equipment. A shadow economy developed around serving libertine society needs, creating additional networks of individuals who were bound by secrecy and financial dependence to support these activities. The artistic commissions weren't just functional, they represented genuine attempts to elevate transgression into high culture. Society leaders believed they were creating new art forms that combined visual, musical, and physical elements into unified aesthetic experiences. They saw themselves as patrons of artistic innovation in areas that conventional society was too repressed to explore. This artistic ambition attracted participation from some genuinely creative individuals who were drawn more by aesthetic possibilities than sexual adventure. Writers, painters, and musicians found in libertine societies opportunities to explore themes and create works that would be impossible in conventional artistic contexts. The societies became alternative cultural institutions that supported artistic expression outside traditional patronage systems. The cultural production of these societies began influencing mainstream Georgian art and literature in subtle but significant ways. Themes that had originated in libertine gatherings began appearing in published poetry, theatrical productions, and even architectural designs. The influence flowed through society members who maintained conventional careers as patrons, critics, or creators in legitimate cultural institutions. This cultural influence represented one of the most significant long-term impacts of Georgian libertinism. While the societies themselves remained secret, their aesthetic innovations and philosophical approaches gradually permeated broader cultural production. Ideas about individual freedom, the artificial nature of moral constraints, and the legitimacy of pleasure-seeking that had developed in libertine circles began appearing in mainstream Enlightenment discourse. The philosophical development within libertine societies had evolved far beyond simple hedonism by the 1770s. members engaged in serious intellectual discussions about the nature of human desire, the social functions of moral rules, and the responsibilities of enlightened individuals toward less sophisticated members of society. These discussions drew on classical sources, contemporary French philosophy, and emerging scientific approaches to understanding human behavior. Some societies developed elaborate theoretical frameworks that positioned libertinism as a form of social progress. They argued that conventional moral constraints were evolutionary adaptations necessary for primitive societies, but counterproductive for advanced civilizations. Enlightened individuals, they claimed, had responsibilities to transcend these limitations and explore more sophisticated approaches to human fulfillment. These philosophical developments weren't merely self-serving justifications. They represented genuine intellectual work that contributed to broader Enlightenment discussions about individual autonomy, social progress, and the relationship between personal freedom and collective welfare. Many of the ideas that would later influence liberal political theory and romantic literary movements had their origins in libertine society discussions. The intellectual sophistication of mature libertine societies also attracted participation from some of the period's most innovative thinkers. Natural philosophers, political theorists, and social critics found in these gatherings opportunities to test ideas that were too radical or controversial for conventional academic or political contexts. The societies became laboratories for intellectual experimentation that paralleled their better-known sexual activities. This intellectual dimension helps explain the lasting influence of Georgian libertinism on subsequent cultural and political developments. The societies weren't just producing scandalous behavior, they were developing alternative frameworks for understanding human nature, social organization, and individual responsibility that would influence Western thought for generations. But the growing sophistication and influence of libertine societies also made them increasingly vulnerable to exposure and political attack. As their membership expanded and their activities became more elaborate, maintaining secrecy became exponentially more difficult. The same organizational innovations that made them more effective also created more opportunities for infiltration, betrayal, and scandal. The political climate of the 1770s made this vulnerability particularly dangerous. Rising tensions with American colonies, ongoing conflicts with France, and increasing domestic political polarization created an environment where any deviation from conventional moral standards could be weaponized for political advantage. Opposition politicians and moral reformers began actively seeking evidence of elite corruption that could discredit their enemies and advance their own causes. The stage was set for the explosive scandals that would eventually expose Georgian libertinism to public scrutiny and transform underground rebellion into public controversy that would reshape British society's relationship with its governing elite. The vulnerability that libertine societies faced by the 1770s wasn't just theoretical, it was becoming dangerously real with each passing year. The very success of these organizations in creating alternative power structures and cultural influence had made them targets for individuals and groups who saw them as threats to traditional British values and political stability. The first major crack in libertine secrecy came from an unexpected source: disgruntled servants and employees who had witnessed society activities but were excluded from their benefits. Unlike society members who were bound by oaths and mutual interests, these working-class observers had no investment in maintaining silence. They possessed detailed knowledge of libertine activities but lacked the social protection that shielded aristocratic participants from consequences. Ambitious journalists and political operatives began systematically cultivating these servants as sources of information. A footman who had served at libertine gatherings might be offered substantial payment for detailed accounts of what he had witnessed. A housekeeper who had cleaned up after society meetings could provide valuable intelligence about the scope and nature of activities. Kitchen staff who had prepared elaborate themed dinners could describe the costumes, decorations, and approximate number of participants. This intelligence gathering created a shadow market for libertine information that operated parallel to the societies themselves. Professional scandalmongers developed networks of informants throughout London's service economy, paying for rumours, speculation, and occasional hard evidence about elite transgression. The most successful of these operators understood that they didn't need complete accuracy. They just needed enough authentic details to make their accusations credible. The political opposition seized on this opportunity with remarkable sophistication. Rather than immediately publishing sensational exposés that might be dismissed as partisan attacks, they began building comprehensive dossiers on libertine activities and participants. They cross-referenced servant testimony with public records, tracking property purchases that might indicate society meeting places, unusual expenditures that might suggest elaborate entertainment, and social connections that might reveal membership networks. This methodical approach created an intelligence apparatus that was remarkably effective at penetrating libertine secrecy. Opposition researchers could often predict society activities, identify new members before they were formally initiated, and even anticipate the themes and locations of upcoming gatherings. The Libertines found themselves under surveillance that was more systematic and professional than anything they had imagined possible. The surveillance network also revealed the true scope of libertine influence in Georgian society. What had appeared to be isolated groups of wealthy hedonists turned out to be interconnected networks that included members of parliament, judges, military officers, church officials, and prominent merchants. The political implications were staggering. These weren't just private scandals, but evidence of alternative power structures that operated outside democratic accountability. The discovery of libertine political influence transformed opposition strategy from moral outrage to constitutional concern. Critics began arguing that libertine societies represented a threat to British governance itself. How could citizens trust representatives who belonged to secret organisations with their own loyalty structures? How could military security be maintained when officers participated in gatherings that included foreign visitors and potential spies? How could religious authority be respected when church officials engaged in activities that directly contradicted Christian moral teaching? These constitutional arguments proved far more effective than simple moral criticism. Georgian society could tolerate aristocratic excess as long as it remained private and didn't interfere with public responsibilities. But evidence that libertine activities were influencing government decisions, military appointments, and judicial proceedings created genuine public concern about the integrity of British institutions. The most damaging revelations concerned the intersection between libertine societies and government contracting. Several society members held positions that involved awarding lucrative military and naval contracts, and evidence suggested that some of these decisions were being influenced by relationships formed during society gatherings. Merchants who participated in libertine activities appeared to receive preferential treatment in bidding processes, while those who refused society invitations found themselves excluded from profitable opportunities. This corruption wasn't necessarily intentional or systematic, but it was inevitable given the social dynamics of libertine societies. When the same individuals who made government decisions also participated in intimate social gatherings, personal relationships would naturally influence professional choices. The problem wasn't necessarily criminal behavior, but rather the creation of alternative networks of trust and obligation that operated outside official channels. The financial implications were enormous. Government contracting represented millions of pounds annually, and even small biases in favour of libertine participants could redirect substantial public resources toward private benefit. Opposition researchers began calculating the potential costs of this influence, producing estimates that suggested libertine corruption might be costing the Treasury hundreds of thousands of pounds per year. These financial arguments resonated with middle-class audiences who were increasingly concerned about government spending and aristocratic privilege. The libertine societies began to symbolize broader problems with elite governance. the sense that wealthy individuals operated by different rules, used public resources for private benefit, and maintained loyalty structures that superseded their obligations to the nation. The moral and financial arguments converged in powerful ways during the 1770s as Britain faced mounting costs from colonial conflicts and European wars. Public frustration with military failures and financial strain created receptive audiences for arguments that connected elite moral corruption with national decline. The Libertine societies became convenient symbols for everything that was wrong with aristocratic governance. This political vulnerability was compounded by generational changes within the societies themselves. The original Libertine leaders, who had created these organizations during the prosperous and relatively stable decades of the early Georgian period, were aging or dying. Their replacements often lacked the same commitment to libertine philosophy and discretion that had characterized the founding generation. Younger members were more likely to treat society participation as fashionable entertainment rather than serious philosophical commitment. They were less careful about maintaining secrecy, more inclined to boast about their adventures, and more willing to use society connections for immediate personal advantage. This generational shift made the societies simultaneously less intellectually serious and more politically dangerous. The changing membership also reflected broader social changes in Georgian England. The expanding commercial economy had created new categories of wealthy individuals who sought aristocratic social acceptance but lacked traditional aristocratic values. These nouveau riche participants often approached libertine societies with entrepreneurial attitudes that prioritized networking and advancement over philosophical exploration. The result was internal tension between traditional libertines who valued transgression for its own sake and strategic participants who used transgressive activities to build business and political connections. Society leaders found themselves managing organizations that were becoming less cohesive and more difficult to control, while simultaneously facing external pressure from increasingly sophisticated opposition surveillance. The most successful societies adapted by creating even more elaborate screening processes and internal security measures. They developed coded communication systems, rotated meeting locations frequently, and established procedures for expelling members who demonstrated insufficient discretion. Some groups even hired former military officers to provide security and counterintelligence services. But these defensive measures only confirmed opposition's suspicions about the scope and significance of libertine activities. The more elaborate the security procedures became, the more obvious it was that these societies had something important to hide. The counterintelligence efforts actually provided additional evidence that libertine organizations were serious political players rather than harmless social clubs. The escalation of security measures also increased the costs and complexity of society participation. What had once been relatively spontaneous gatherings of like-minded aristocrats became carefully orchestrated events that required extensive planning and resources. The administrative burden began to overwhelm the pleasure that had originally motivated participation. Some long-term members began questioning whether the societies had evolved beyond their original purposes. The elaborate rituals and security procedures sometimes seemed to generate more anxiety than excitement. The constant concern about exposure and betrayal created an atmosphere of suspicion that was antithetical to the open exploration of pleasure that had characterized early libertinism. These internal doubts were compounded by external pressure from family members who were becoming aware of society activities and concerned about potential consequences. Wives who had initially tolerated or even supported their husbands' libertine adventures began demanding withdrawal as the political risks became apparent. Adult children worried about inheritance implications if family patriarchs became involved in major scandals. The family pressure was particularly significant because it came from individuals who couldn't be dismissed as political enemies or moral zealots. These were people who shared the aristocratic values and social positions of society members, but who could see that libertine activities were becoming politically untenable. Their concerns carried weight that external criticism couldn't match. By the late 1770s, the most prudent society members were beginning to withdraw from active participation while maintaining social connections with their libertine colleagues. This created a new category of former members who possessed detailed knowledge of society activities, but no longer had strong incentives to maintain secrecy. Some of these individuals became sources for opposition researchers, providing insider perspectives that external surveillance couldn't obtain. The defection of former members represented the most serious threat to society security because these individuals understood internal procedures and could provide authentic details that would make public exposés credible. Unlike servant testimony, which could be dismissed as unreliable or motivated by class resentment, former member accounts carried the authority of aristocratic witnesses with first-hand experience. Opposition researchers began developing sophisticated approaches to cultivating these former members as sources. Rather than offering direct payment, which might be offensive to aristocratic sensibilities, they provided opportunities for political advancement or social rehabilitation that could help former libertines rebuild their reputations in conventional society. The most effective approach involved offering former society members chances to demonstrate their reformation through public service or charitable activities. A former libertine who was concerned about his reputation could volunteer for highly visible moral reform projects, serve on committees investigating social problems, or contribute generously to religious or educational causes. These activities provided evidence of transformation while creating opportunities to share insider knowledge with opposition researchers. This rehabilitation process created incentives for former members to exaggerate the transgressive nature of society activities they had witnessed. The more shocking their accounts of libertine excess, the more dramatic their apparent transformation, and the more valuable their contributions to moral reform efforts. This dynamic inflated the sensational aspects of opposition exposés while providing authentic details that made the accounts credible. The combination of former member testimony, servant intelligence, and opposition research was creating an unprecedented threat to libertine secrecy. By 1780, opposition groups possessed detailed information about society membership, meeting locations, internal procedures, and specific activities that could support devastating public exposés. The question was no longer whether major scandals would emerge, but rather when and how they would be deployed for maximum political impact. The libertine societies found themselves in an impossible position. They could try to continue their activities under increasingly difficult security conditions, or they could dissolve voluntarily and hope to avoid major scandals. Neither option was attractive, and different societies began pursuing different survival strategies that would ultimately determine their fates during the explosive decade that was about to unfold. The most aggressive societies decided to escalate their activities, reasoning that if they were going to be exposed anyway, they might as well enjoy the most transgressive experiences possible while they still could. This approach led to increasingly elaborate and risky gatherings that pushed boundaries even further than previous generations had imagined. Other societies attempted to reform themselves into more conventional social clubs, gradually eliminating the most scandalous activities while maintaining their exclusive membership and social networking functions. This strategy appealed to members who valued the connections more than the transgression, but it also created internal conflicts with traditionalists who viewed reform as betrayal of libertine principles. A few societies attempted to relocate their activities outside Britain, establishing meeting places in France or other European locations, where British political opposition would have less influence. This international strategy offered some protection from domestic scandal, but created new vulnerabilities related to foreign surveillance and diplomatic complications. The most sophisticated societies pursued complex strategies that combined elements of all these approaches while developing new forms of plausible deniability. They created legitimate front organizations that could explain their meetings and expenditures, developed cover stories that could account for their social connections, and established legal defenses that could protect members if scandals did emerge. But regardless of the specific strategies they pursued, all libertine societies faced the same fundamental challenge. Their culture of organized transgression had become incompatible with the political and social realities of late Georgian England. The same forces that had originally enabled their development, aristocratic privilege, economic prosperity, and political stability, were now creating the conditions for their exposure and destruction. The stage was set for confrontations that would transform these private experiments in alternative morality into public scandals that would reshape British society's understanding of elite behaviour, political accountability, and the relationship between private conduct and public responsibility. The Libertines had spent decades creating alternative worlds where different rules applied, but they were about to discover that the conventional world still had the power to impose its own standards of judgment and consequence. The reckoning that was approaching would involve more than simple moral outrage or political embarrassment. It would raise fundamental questions about the nature of aristocratic privilege, the limits of individual freedom, and the responsibilities that came with wealth and power in a society that was becoming increasingly democratic and morally demanding. The Libertines had believed they were pioneering new forms of human freedom and social organization, but they were about to learn that their experiments had created as many problems as solutions, and that the price of transcending conventional morality might be higher than they had ever imagined possible. The year 1781 marked a turning point that few Libertines saw coming. What began as whispered rumours in coffee houses suddenly exploded into full parliamentary debate when a disgraced former society member named James Townsend made a desperate decision that would change everything. Townsend had been expelled from the notorious Medmenham Circle after a dispute over gambling debts, but he possessed something far more valuable than money: detailed knowledge of society rituals, membership lists, and the location of secret chambers that contained evidence of activities that would shock even hardened political observers. Facing personal bankruptcy and social ostracism, Townsend approached opposition leader Edmund Burke with an offer that was impossible to ignore. He would provide complete documentation of Libertine society activities in exchange for political protection and financial support. The information he offered wasn't just gossip or speculation. It was detailed evidence that could prove systematic corruption at the highest levels of British government. Burke recognised immediately that this intelligence could reshape British politics. The American colonial war was going badly, public finances were strained, and King George III's mental health was becoming a source of national concern. Evidence of widespread moral corruption among the governing elite could provide the leverage needed to force major political reforms. But Burke was also sophisticated enough to understand that the information needed to be deployed strategically rather than sensationally. Simply publishing lurid accounts of aristocratic orgies might create temporary embarrassment but wouldn't produce lasting political change. The evidence needed to be presented in ways that connected private moral corruption with specific public policy failures. The strategy that emerged was brilliant in its complexity. Rather than launching direct attacks on Libertine societies, Burke's allies began investigating government contracting irregularities, military appointment controversies, and judicial decisions that seemed to favour particular commercial interests. Each investigation was carefully designed to expose connections between official decisions and Libertine society relationships. The first major breakthrough came when parliamentary investigators discovered that naval supply contracts worth over £200,000 had been awarded to merchants who were later identified as members of the same Libertine society as the Admiralty officials who had made the decisions. The contracts themselves weren't necessarily fraudulent, but the selection process had clearly been influenced by personal relationships formed during society gatherings. This revelation transformed public understanding of Libertine societies from private moral issues to matters of national security. If society relationships were influencing military procurement during wartime, then these organisations represented genuine threats to British defence capabilities. Opposition politicians began arguing that libertine corruption might be contributing to military failures in America and elsewhere. The military connection proved particularly damaging because it couldn't be dismissed as partisan political criticism. Military officers who participated in libertine societies were violating explicit regulations about maintaining appropriate relationships with civilian contractors and foreign nationals. Several high-ranking officers faced court-martial proceedings that exposed additional details about society activities and membership. The court-martial evidence revealed that libertine societies had become remarkably international in their scope. French merchants, Dutch financiers, and even American colonial representatives had participated in society gatherings, creating opportunities for intelligence gathering and influence operations that military officials had never anticipated or reported to their superiors. The international dimension raised questions that went far beyond simple moral corruption. If British military and political leaders were participating in intimate gatherings with foreign nationals during wartime, then national security might be compromised in ways that could affect military strategy and diplomatic negotiations. Parliamentary investigators began treating libertine societies as potential espionage networks, rather than mere social clubs. This security analysis revealed connections that were genuinely alarming. Several society members had business relationships with French suppliers who were simultaneously selling materials to French military forces fighting against Britain in America. Other members had received substantial loans from Dutch banks that were known to be financing French military operations. The web of financial relationships that investigators uncovered suggested that libertine social connections might be facilitating enemy access to British resources and intelligence. The most shocking discovery involved coded correspondence between society members that used libertine ritual terminology to discuss military and political information. Messages that appeared to be planning social gatherings actually contained details about troop movements, supply shortages, and strategic planning that could have been valuable to enemy forces. Whether this information was actually transmitted to foreign agents remained unclear, but the potential for such transmission was undeniable. These revelations created panic within government circles that extended far beyond libertine society members. Officials who had never participated in society activities began worrying about guilt by association, while military commanders started questioning the loyalty of subordinates who had any connection to society members. The investigation was creating an atmosphere of suspicion that threatened to paralyze government operations. King George III himself became involved when investigators discovered that several of his personal advisors had participated in libertine gatherings where foreign diplomats were present. The king's already fragile mental state was further strained by concerns that his most trusted counsellors might have been compromised by their social activities. Royal household officials began conducting their own internal investigations to identify potential security risks. The royal involvement elevated the scandal to constitutional dimensions. Parliament began debating whether libertine society participation should disqualify individuals from holding government positions, while legal scholars argued about whether society activities might constitute treason under certain circumstances. The question was no longer just about moral propriety, but about the fundamental requirements for public service. The constitutional debates revealed deep divisions within British society about the relationship between private behaviour and public responsibility. Traditional aristocrats argued that private moral choices shouldn't affect professional competence, while middle-class reformers insisted that moral character was essential for public trust. The libertine scandal became a proxy for broader conflicts about social change and political representation. These debates were complicated by the fact that many of the most effective government officials had been libertine society members. Several of Britain's most successful military commanders, accomplished diplomats, and innovative administrators were implicated in society activities. Simply removing all libertine participants from government service would have created administrative chaos during wartime. This practical consideration forced politicians to develop more nuanced approaches to the scandal. Rather than demanding immediate mass resignations, parliamentary leaders began negotiating selective removals and reformed procedures that could address security concerns while maintaining government functionality. The compromise solutions satisfied neither moral reformers nor libertine defenders, but they prevented complete political collapse. The negotiation process revealed the true extent of libertine influence in Georgian society. Nearly every major government department, military service, and commercial sector included individuals who had participated in society activities. The networks of personal relationships, business connections, and social obligations that had developed around libertine societies had become integral to how British elite society functioned. Dismantling these networks entirely would have required rebuilding British social and economic structures from the ground up, a task that was impossible during wartime and probably undesirable even during peacetime. The libertine societies had become so embedded in elite culture that removing them completely would have eliminated much of the informal coordination that made British governance effective. This realization led to a different kind of reform strategy focused on transparency and accountability rather than prohibition. New regulations required government officials to disclose social memberships and financial relationships that might create conflicts of interest. Parliamentary oversight committees gained expanded authority to investigate decision-making processes and ensure that personal relationships weren't improperly influencing official choices. The transparency requirements had immediate effects on libertine society operations. Many members withdrew from active participation rather than face the scrutiny that disclosure would bring. Others attempted to maintain their involvement while carefully documenting their compliance with new regulations. A few defiant societies continued their activities while openly challenging the legitimacy of parliamentary oversight. The most resilient societies adapted by transforming themselves into different types of organizations that could provide similar social benefits while avoiding regulatory scrutiny. Some became legitimate gentlemen's clubs focused on business networking and political discussion. Others evolved into cultural societies that supported artistic and intellectual activities. A few maintained their transgressive character, but moved their operations to private estates outside London, where oversight was more difficult. These adaptations preserved some libertine social networks, while eliminating their most problematic aspects. Former society members could maintain their relationships and continue coordinating their activities, but they had to operate within legal and regulatory frameworks that limited their ability to abuse public trust. The compromise satisfied practical political needs, while acknowledging that complete elimination of elite social coordination was neither possible nor desirable. But the transformation process also revealed how shallow libertine philosophical commitments had become by the 1780s. When faced with real consequences for their transgressive activities, most society members chose respectability over rebellion. The elaborate theoretical frameworks that had justified libertine behavior proved less important than maintaining social status and political influence. The few societies that maintained their commitment to transgressive principles found themselves increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Without the protection that came from including powerful government officials and wealthy merchants, these groups became easier targets for continued investigation and prosecution. Several faced criminal charges related to activities that had been tolerated when their membership included influential political figures. The criminal prosecutions provided additional evidence about the evolution of libertine activities during the 1770s. Court testimony revealed that some societies had indeed escalated their transgressive behavior to levels that violated existing laws about public decency, gambling, and even assault. The activities that had begun as philosophical rebellion against conventional morality had sometimes evolved into genuinely criminal behavior. The most serious charges involved activities at rural estate gatherings where normal social constraints were completely abandoned. Testimony from servants and former participants described scenes that included forced participation, physical violence, and exploitation of vulnerable individuals who had been coerced or deceived into attending. These accounts suggested that some libertine societies had evolved into criminal organizations that use philosophical justifications to cover genuinely harmful behavior. The criminal revelations fundamentally changed public understanding of libertinism from aristocratic excess to predatory exploitation. Middle-class audiences, who might have been willing to tolerate elite hedonism, became outraged by evidence of actual harm to vulnerable individuals. The moral argument against libertine societies gained new force when it could point to specific victims rather than abstract principles. The victim testimony was particularly powerful because it came from individuals who had initially been willing participants in libertine activities. These weren't moral reformers or political opponents making abstract arguments. They were people who had experienced libertine culture firsthand and could describe how it had evolved from consensual experimentation to coercive exploitation. The most damaging testimony came from women who had participated in libertine gatherings as entertainers, companions, or guests. Their accounts described a culture that had gradually normalized increasingly aggressive and humiliating treatment of female participants. Activities that had begun as mutual exploration of pleasure had evolved into systematic exploitation that treated women as objects for male entertainment, rather than equal participants in transgressive experiences. These accounts challenged the libertine society's self-image as pioneers of sexual freedom and enlightened pleasure. If their activities were actually reinforcing and amplifying traditional patterns of male dominance and female subordination, then their claims about transcending conventional morality were fraudulent. They weren't creating alternative social structures. They were using philosophical justifications to intensify existing forms of exploitation. The feminist critique of libertinism proved particularly effective because it came from women who had initially supported libertine principles. These weren't conventional moralists arguing for traditional restrictions on sexuality. They were advocates for genuine sexual freedom who had discovered that libertine societies weren't delivering on their promises of liberation and equality. The women's testimony also revealed the economic dimensions of libertine exploitation. Many female participants had been dependent on society members for financial support, housing, or career opportunities that made it difficult to refuse participation in activities that became increasingly degrading over time. The libertine societies had created economic relationships that enabled coercion while maintaining the fiction of voluntary participation. These economic relationships extended beyond individual exploitation to systematic patterns that affected entire sectors of Georgian society. Actresses, artists, musicians, and other cultural workers had become dependent on libertine patronage networks that required sexual availability as implicit conditions for professional advancement. The societies had created parallel economic structures that used sexual coercion as a mechanism for controlling cultural production. The cultural implications were staggering. If libertine patronage networks had been shaping artistic and intellectual production through implicit sexual coercion, then much of what Georgian society considered its greatest cultural achievement might have been produced under conditions that compromised creative independence and integrity. The libertine influence on mainstream culture appeared far more problematic when viewed through the lens of systematic exploitation. This realization prompted broader reconsideration of libertine contributions to Enlightenment thought and cultural innovation. Ideas about individual freedom, sexual liberation, and social progress that had emerged from libertine circles needed to be re-evaluated in light of evidence that these same circles had been perpetuating and intensifying forms of exploitation that contradicted their stated principles. The intellectual reckoning proved as significant as the political and legal consequences. Scholars, writers, and philosophers who had been influenced by libertine ideas began questioning whether those ideas were genuinely progressive or merely sophisticated justifications for traditional forms of aristocratic privilege and exploitation. The libertine contribution to enlightenment thought appeared far more ambiguous when examined alongside evidence of systematic harm. This intellectual crisis extended beyond immediate libertine circles to affect broader Georgian culture. If the social elite, who had been leading cultural and intellectual innovation, were revealed to be exploitative and corrupt, then what did that suggest about the direction of British civilization? The Libertine scandal raised fundamental questions about the relationship between cultural achievement and moral character that British society was unprepared to answer. The crisis of confidence in elite leadership created opportunities for alternative voices and perspectives that had been marginalised by libertine-dominated cultural institutions. Middle-class moral reformers, religious revivalists, and emerging feminist voices gained influence as traditional aristocratic authority was discredited. The Libertine scandal accelerated social changes that were already transforming British society. The transformation wasn't just about replacing one elite group with another. It was about fundamentally restructuring the relationship between private behaviour and public authority. The idea that personal moral character was irrelevant to professional competence, which had been central to libertine philosophy, was being replaced by demands for transparency, accountability, and moral consistency that would reshape British public life. These changes would have lasting effects that extended far beyond the immediate libertine controversy. The principles of public accountability and moral transparency that emerged from the libertine scandals would influence British political development for generations, contributing to reforms that made government more responsive to middle-class values and democratic pressures. But in the immediate aftermath of the scandal, British society faced the challenge of rebuilding elite institutions and cultural networks that had been thoroughly compromised by libertine corruption. The process would be neither quick nor easy, and it would require confronting fundamental questions about power, privilege, and responsibility that Georgian society had been avoiding for decades. The libertine legacy would prove far more complex and enduring than anyone had anticipated. While their organised societies were destroyed and their immediate political influence was eliminated, the questions they had raised about individual freedom, social constraint, and the relationship between pleasure and responsibility would continue to influence British culture long after their secret chambers had been closed and their elaborate rituals had been abandoned. The rebuilding process that followed the libertine scandals would prove to be one of the most fascinating chapters in Georgian social history, because it revealed just how deeply these networks of organised transgression had penetrated British society. What emerged wasn't a simple return to traditional morality, but something entirely new, a hybrid culture that combined middle-class respectability with aristocratic sophistication in ways that would define Victorian society. The immediate aftermath created a social vacuum that ambitious individuals rushed to fill. Middle-class merchants, professional lawyers, and even successful tradesmen suddenly found themselves invited to social gatherings that had previously been exclusively aristocratic. The old networks of influence and patronage had been so thoroughly discredited that entirely new systems needed to be constructed almost from scratch. This social restructuring happened remarkably quickly, but it wasn't without its complications. The new social leaders lacked the casual confidence that had characterized aristocratic libertines. They were intensely concerned with maintaining respectability and avoiding any hint of scandal that might compromise their newly elevated positions. This created a social atmosphere that was simultaneously more democratic and more restrictive than what had existed before. The transformation was most visible in London's entertainment culture. The masquerade balls that had served as hunting grounds for libertine societies were replaced by carefully supervised social gatherings, where behaviour was monitored by committees of respectable matrons. The theatres that had provided actresses for aristocratic adventures were reformed under new management that emphasised moral instruction over sensual entertainment. But the most significant change occurred in the private spaces where elite socialisation had traditionally taken place. The abandoned monasteries and country estates that had housed libertine ceremonies were either demolished or converted into conventional meeting places for legitimate charitable and cultural organizations. The secret chambers with their elaborate decorations were sealed or destroyed, eliminating the physical infrastructure that had supported organized transgression. This physical transformation had profound psychological effects on former Libertine participants. Without the specialized spaces that had enabled their alternative identities, many found it difficult to maintain even private commitment to Libertine principles. The elaborate costumes, ritual objects, and ceremonial paraphernalia that had been so important to Libertine culture were sold, hidden, or destroyed as former members sought to eliminate evidence of their past involvement. The destruction of Libertine material culture represented more than just practical precaution. It symbolized the complete rejection of the aesthetic and philosophical principles that had justified transgressive behavior. Former Libertines weren't just changing their actions, they were abandoning entire ways of understanding pleasure, beauty, and human possibility that had shaped their identities for decades. This cultural abandonment created unexpected opportunities for scholars and collectors who recognized the historical significance of Libertine artifacts. Private collectors began secretly acquiring the costumes, artworks, and ceremonial objects that former society members were eager to dispose of. These collections would eventually become important resources for understanding Georgian Libertine culture, but at the time they represented dangerous contraband that could compromise anyone associated with them. The most valuable artifacts were the written records that some societies had maintained, membership lists, ceremony descriptions, philosophical treatises, and correspondence that documented the development of Libertine thought and practice over several decades. Most of these documents were destroyed immediately after the scandals broke, but a few collections survived in private hands, where they remained hidden for generations. The destruction of documentary evidence makes it difficult for modern historians to fully understand the scope and sophistication of Georgian libertinism. What survived tends to be either sensationalized accounts from hostile observers or sanitized versions that eliminate the most transgressive details. The authentic voices of Libertine participants, particularly women and working-class individuals who were most vulnerable to exploitation, are largely lost to historical record. This documentary gap has allowed romanticized versions of Libertine culture to persist in popular imagination. Without access to detailed accounts of the coercion, exploitation, and genuine harm that characterized mature Libertine societies, it's easy to imagine them as glamorous experiments in sexual freedom, rather than complex systems that combined philosophical sophistication with systematic abuse. The romanticization process began almost immediately after the scandals ended. Former participants who had escaped serious consequences began crafting sanitized versions of their experiences that emphasized the intellectual and aesthetic dimensions while minimizing the harmful aspects. These accounts presented libertinism as misguided idealism rather than predatory exploitation, allowing former members to maintain some dignity while accepting moral reform. The sanitized narratives were particularly appealing to middle-class audiences who were simultaneously fascinated and horrified by aristocratic excess. Stories about philosophical discussions in classical settings were more palatable than accounts of systematic sexual coercion, so those became the versions that were preserved in memoirs, novels, and historical accounts written during the early 19th century. This selective preservation of Libertine memory had lasting effects on how British society understood the relationship between aristocratic culture and moral corruption. The focus on philosophical and aesthetic dimensions obscured the economic and political systems that had enabled Libertine exploitation, making it easier to treat the scandals as isolated moral failures rather than symptoms of structural problems with elite power. The failure to understand the systematic dimensions of Libertine corruption meant that many of the conditions that had enabled their activities remained in place even after the societies themselves were destroyed. The economic relationships that had made cultural workers dependent on elite patronage, the political networks that had facilitated corruption, and the social hierarchies that had enabled exploitation continued to operate under new management. This continuity ensured that new forms of elite misconduct would emerge to replace the old libertine societies. The specific rituals and philosophical justifications were abandoned, but the underlying systems that had enabled wealthy and powerful individuals to exploit their positions for personal gratification remained largely intact. British society had eliminated the symptoms while preserving the disease. The new forms of elite misconduct were often more subtle and harder to detect than the elaborate ceremonies of libertine societies. Instead of organized gatherings with formal membership, corruption became more individualized and opportunistic. Instead of philosophical justifications for transgression, exploitation was simply hidden behind conventional respectability. This evolution made elite misconduct more difficult to expose and prosecute. Libertine societies had created extensive evidence trails through their elaborate organization and documentation. Individual corruption operating within conventional institutions was much harder to detect and prove, especially when it was practiced by individuals who had learned from libertine mistakes about the importance of discretion and deniability. The regulatory reforms that had been implemented in response to libertine scandals were designed to address organized conspiracy rather than individual opportunism. They required disclosure of formal memberships and financial relationships, but they couldn't prevent the informal networks and implicit understandings that continued to facilitate elite coordination and mutual benefit. The most successful post-libertine elites learned to achieve many of the same benefits that societies had provided while avoiding the risks that had destroyed their predecessors. They developed more sophisticated approaches to networking that relied on legitimate institutions, created financial arrangements that were technically legal but practically corrupt, and maintained social relationships that enabled coordination without requiring explicit organization. These evolved forms of elite coordination were in some ways more effective than the libertine societies they replaced. They achieved similar results in terms of mutual benefit and protection, while avoiding the vulnerabilities that came from formal organization and elaborate ritual. The post-libertine elite was more professional and less theatrical, but not necessarily less corrupt or exploitative. The professionalization of elite corruption had significant implications for British social development. It meant that the reform movements that had successfully exposed libertine societies would be less effective against their successors. The new forms of elite misconduct were embedded within legitimate institutions and operated according to conventional social norms, making them much harder to identify and challenge. This dynamic helps explain why the moral reform movements that had been so successful during the libertine crisis gradually lost momentum during the early 19th century. The obvious targets had been eliminated, but the underlying problems had simply become more subtle and sophisticated. Reform energy was dissipated because the new forms of corruption were harder to recognize and mobilize against. The evolution of elite misconduct also affected the development of middle-class moral culture. The dramatic success of anti-libertine campaigns created expectations that moral reform could produce fundamental social change through exposure and public pressure. When similar campaigns proved less effective against post-libertine corruption, middle-class reformers began to lose confidence in the possibility of meaningful elite accountability. This loss of reform confidence contributed to the development of Victorian moral culture, which emphasized individual character and personal responsibility rather than systematic social change. If elite corruption couldn't be eliminated through political action, then perhaps social progress could be achieved through individual moral improvement and cultural transformation. The shift from political to cultural reform strategies had profound effects on British society. Instead of continuing to challenge elite power directly, middle-class reformers focused on creating alternative institutions and cultural practices that could provide moral leadership independent of aristocratic influence. This approach was less confrontational, but also less effective at addressing systematic forms of exploitation and corruption. The cultural reform strategy did produce significant achievements in education, religious revival, and social service provision. Middle-class reformers created schools, hospitals, charitable organizations, and religious institutions that provided alternatives to elite-dominated systems. These achievements were genuine and important, but they also allowed elite corruption to continue operating in spheres that were less visible to middle-class attention. The division of British society into separate moral spheres, one dominated by middle-class respectability and another controlled by reformed but still privileged elites, became one of the defining characteristics of Victorian culture. This separation allowed both groups to maintain their distinct identities and interests, while avoiding the direct confrontations that had characterized the Libertine crisis. The separation also created new forms of hypocrisy that were in some ways more problematic than the open transgression of Libertine societies. Victorian elite culture maintained facades of respectability while continuing many of the exploitative practices that had characterized libertinism. The difference was that these practices were now hidden behind conventional moral language rather than justified through alternative philosophical frameworks. The hidden nature of Victorian elite misconduct made it more difficult for victims to seek redress or for critics to mobilize opposition. Libertine societies had been vulnerable precisely because they were organized and visible. Victorian corruption operated through informal networks and individual relationships that were much harder to expose and challenge. This evolution had particularly negative effects on the women who had been most victimized by libertine exploitation. Under the libertine system, at least some women had been able to gain influence and resources through their relationships with society members. Under the Victorian system, similar exploitation continued, but without even the limited opportunities for female agency and advancement that libertine culture had sometimes provided. The Victorian emphasis on female respectability also made it more difficult for women to speak publicly about sexual exploitation or to organize collective responses to male misconduct. The moral reform movements that had successfully challenged libertine societies were dominated by male leaders who were more interested in controlling female sexuality than in protecting female autonomy. This gender dynamic reveals one of the most troubling aspects of the post-libertine transformation. While the specific forms of sexual exploitation that had characterized libertine societies were eliminated, the underlying gender hierarchies that had enabled that exploitation were actually reinforced through Victorian moral ideology. Women gained protection from some forms of abuse, while losing opportunities for independence and self-determination. The class dimensions of the transformation were similarly complex and contradictory. Middle-class moral reform had successfully challenged aristocratic privilege in some areas, while creating new forms of class-based exploitation in others. The domestic service system that supported Victorian respectability often involved working-class women in conditions that were as exploitative as anything that had existed under libertine patronage. The economic relationships that had enabled libertine exploitation weren't eliminated. They were reorganized under different moral justifications. Victorian employers could exploit domestic workers, factory hands, and service providers while maintaining reputations for moral respectability that had been impossible under the libertine system. This reorganization of exploitation under respectable moral frameworks became one of the defining characteristics of Victorian society. The dramatic public confrontations between transgression and respectability that had characterized the libertine crisis were replaced by more subtle forms of moral management that were equally effective at maintaining elite privilege. The subtlety of Victorian moral management made it more durable than the libertine system it replaced. Libertine societies had been vulnerable to exposure and scandal precisely because they operated in open defiance of conventional morality. Victorian elite culture achieved similar results while maintaining plausible claims to moral authority. This durability helps explain why Victorian moral culture proved so influential and long-lasting. It provided effective solutions to the practical problems of elite coordination and privilege maintenance, while avoiding the vulnerabilities that had destroyed its libertine predecessors. The system was less theatrical and philosophically interesting than libertinism, but it was much more politically sustainable. The political sustainability of Victorian moral culture also depended on its ability to provide meaningful benefits to middle-class supporters while maintaining elite privilege. The system offered genuine opportunities for middle-class advancement and moral authority, while preserving the fundamental structures that enabled upper-class dominance. This balance between middle-class opportunity and elite privilege became the foundation for British social stability throughout the 19th century. The dramatic conflicts between transgression and respectability that had characterized the Georgian period were replaced by more manageable tensions that could be negotiated through established political and cultural institutions. The negotiation process required constant adjustment and compromise, but it avoided the explosive confrontations that had made libertine culture politically untenable. Victorian society achieved a form of moral equilibrium that was stable enough to support imperial expansion, industrial development, and gradual democratic reform without fundamental social revolution. But this stability came at significant costs that would only become apparent over time. The suppression of open discussion about sexuality, power, and exploitation created psychological and cultural problems that would eventually require their own forms of social reform. The Victorian solution to the libertine crisis was effective in the short term, but it created new problems that would challenge British society throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The legacy of Georgian libertinism thus extends far beyond the immediate scandals that destroyed the societies themselves. The crisis they created forced British society to confront fundamental questions about power, privilege, and responsibility that continue to influence social development long after the last secret chamber had been sealed and the final ritual costume had been burned. Understanding this legacy requires recognizing both the genuine problems that libertine societies created and the limitations of the Victorian solutions that replaced them. The libertines were neither romantic rebels against oppressive convention, nor simple villains exploiting innocent victims. They were complex individuals operating within social systems that enabled both creativity and corruption, liberation and exploitation. The societies they created were similarly complex institutions that combined philosophical sophistication with systematic abuse, aesthetic innovation with predatory exploitation, and genuine social experimentation with cynical privilege maintenance. Their ultimate destruction was probably inevitable and certainly necessary, but it also eliminated possibilities for alternative forms of social organization that might have produced more equitable and humane outcomes. The Victorian culture that emerged from the libertine crisis was more stable and sustainable than what it replaced, but it was also more restrictive and hypocritical. The open acknowledgement of human desire and social conflict that had characterized libertine discourse was replaced by moral languages that obscured more than they revealed about the actual operation of power and privilege in British society. This obscuration had lasting effects on British cultural development. The inability to discuss sexuality, exploitation, and social conflict openly created psychological pressures and cultural contradictions that would eventually require their own forms of revolutionary response. The libertine crisis was resolved, but not solved. The fundamental tensions it revealed about human nature, social organization, and moral authority would continue to shape British society for generations to come. The Victorian compromise that emerged from the ashes of libertine scandal seemed to offer a permanent solution to the problems of elite transgression, but beneath the surface of respectable society, the fundamental human drives that had originally motivated libertine rebellion were simply being redirected rather than eliminated. The result was a culture of elite debauchery that was simultaneously more pervasive and more carefully concealed than anything the organized societies had achieved. The key difference was structural rather than moral. Instead of concentrated transgression in formal societies with elaborate rituals and fixed memberships, Georgian elite culture developed what we might call distributed debauchery, a network of overlapping activities venues, and relationships that provided similar opportunities for transgressive behavior while avoiding the organizational vulnerabilities that had destroyed the Libertine societies. This distributed system was far more resilient because it operated through multiple independent channels that couldn't be eliminated through single investigations or mass prosecutions. A masquerade ball that became too notorious could be discontinued without affecting private dinner parties, country house gatherings, or theatrical entertainments that served similar functions. The elimination of one venue or activity simply redirected demand toward alternatives that were often more creative and transgressive than what they replaced. The masquerade ball culture that flourished during the 1760s and 1770s perfectly exemplified this distributed approach to elite transgression. Unlike the concentrated activities of Libertine societies, masquerades were publicly advertised events that anyone with sufficient wealth could attend. This public character provided plausible deniability for participants while creating opportunities for anonymous encounters that were often more daring than anything attempted in organized societies. The genius of masquerade culture lay in its combination of public accessibility with practical exclusivity. While advertisements might suggest that tickets were available to anyone willing to pay, the actual social dynamics ensured that only individuals with appropriate connections and cultural sophistication would feel comfortable participating. The elaborate costume requirements, complex social protocols, and expensive venue fees created barriers that were more effective than formal membership procedures. This selective accessibility allowed masquerade organizers to attract precisely the mixture of participants that created the most exciting social dynamics. Established aristocrats provided social legitimacy and financial resources, while ambitious newcomers brought energy and willingness to push boundaries. Professional entertainers contributed artistic sophistication, and wealthy merchants offered commercial connections that could be valuable for various purposes. The costume element was crucial to the success of masquerade culture because it provided psychological permission for behavior that would be impossible in conventional social settings. The anonymity wasn't complete. Experienced participants often recognized each other despite elaborate disguises, but it was sufficient to create a sense of temporary freedom from normal social constraints and consequences. The most sophisticated masquerade events became elaborate theatrical productions that rivaled anything created by organized Libertine societies. Venue decorations would transform entire buildings into fantasy environments, classical temples, oriental palaces, or mythological landscapes that transported participants into alternative worlds where different rules applied. Professional musicians, dancers, and actors would provide entertainment that gradually became more provocative as evenings progressed and inhibitions dissolved. The progression from respectable entertainment to transgressive activity was carefully orchestrated through environmental design and social management. Early evening activities would be relatively conventional: elegant dancing, sophisticated conversation, and artistic performances that could be enjoyed by the most respectable participants. As the night advanced, the entertainment would become more suggestive, the costumes more revealing, and the social interactions more intimate. This gradual escalation allowed participants to choose their own level of involvement without making explicit commitments to transgressive behavior. Someone could attend a masquerade for perfectly respectable social reasons and simply leave when activities became too provocative for their comfort. Alternatively, they could remain and gradually participate in increasingly daring activities as the evening evolved. The flexibility of masquerade participation made these events attractive to a much broader range of people than Libertine societies had ever reached. Respectable married couples could attend together for the dancing and entertainment, while individuals seeking more adventurous experiences could find opportunities for private encounters in the maze-like arrangements of curtained alcoves, garden pavilions, and secluded chambers that characterized well-designed masquerade venues. The architectural sophistication of masquerade venues became increasingly elaborate as organizers competed to create the most memorable and transgressive experiences. the most successful venues combined public spaces for general entertainment with semi-private areas for intimate conversations and fully private chambers for activities that required complete discretion. The spatial design guided participants through gradually increasing levels of transgression, while maintaining plausible deniability about what was actually occurring. The Haymarket Opera House, which had been mentioned in the earlier accounts, represented the pinnacle of masquerade venue design. The building's complex layout included multiple levels, hidden passages, and adjustable partitions that could transform the space throughout the evening to accommodate different types of activities. The orchestra level provided space for general dancing and socializing, while upper galleries offered more intimate settings for private conversations and romantic encounters. But the real innovation was in the basement chambers that could only be accessed through concealed stairways known to regular participants. These underground spaces were decorated with explicitly erotic artwork and furnished with specialized equipment that facilitated group activities that would have been impossible in the public areas above. The contrast between the respectable entertainment upstairs and the transgressive activities below created a sense of forbidden adventure that was intensely appealing to participants. The underground chambers also solved the practical problem of managing different levels of participant comfort and experience. Newcomers could enjoy the public festivities without being confronted with activities that might shock or offend them, while experienced participants could access more intense experiences without having to worry about scandalizing innocent observers. The spatial segregation allowed the same event to serve multiple audiences simultaneously. This multi-level approach became the standard model for elite entertainment venues throughout London. Private clubs, country estates, and even residential properties began incorporating hidden spaces and flexible layouts that could accommodate both respectable socializing and transgressive activities, depending on the occasion and the guest list. The architectural infrastructure for elite debauchery became embedded in the physical fabric of Georgian London. The integration of transgressive space into conventional architecture reflected the broader cultural shift from organized rebellion against moral constraints to systematic accommodation of transgressive desires within respectable social structures. Rather than creating alternative societies that operated in opposition to conventional morality, elite culture developed hybrid institutions that could serve both respectable and transgressive functions depending on circumstances. This institutional flexibility was particularly evident in the country house culture that flourished among wealthy landowners during the later Georgian period. These rural estates provided perfect venues for extended gatherings that could evolve from conventional house parties into elaborate orgies without requiring participants to make explicit commitments to transgressive behavior. The country house setting offered several advantages over urban venues. The isolation provided natural protection from observation and interference, while the extended duration of rural gatherings allowed for gradual escalation of activities that would be impossible in single-evening urban events. Participants could arrive for what appeared to be conventional social visits, and gradually become involved in increasingly transgressive activities as their comfort levels and social relationships developed. The most sophisticated country house hosts understood that successful transgressive entertainment required careful attention to participant psychology and group dynamics. They would invite carefully selected combinations of guests who could be expected to create interesting social chemistry while providing activities and entertainment that would naturally lead toward increasingly intimate interactions. The entertainment programming at elite country house gatherings became remarkably sophisticated, combining elements of theatre, music, literature, and visual art in ways that created immersive experiences designed to break down normal social barriers. Theatrical performances might feature audience participation that gradually became more intimate, while musical entertainments could include dancing that evolved from conventional social forms into more sensual expressions. Literary activities were particularly popular because they provided intellectual justification for increasingly transgressive themes. Poetry readings might begin with classical works and gradually progress to contemporary pieces with explicit sexual content. while storytelling sessions could evolve into collaborative narrative creation that allowed participants to explore fantasies and desires that would be impossible to express in conventional social settings. The intellectual framework was crucial to the success of country house transgression because it allowed participants to maintain their self-image as sophisticated individuals, engaging in cultural exploration rather than simple hedonistic indulgence. The combination of artistic sophistication with sensual pleasure created experiences that felt elevated and meaningful rather than merely decadent. This intellectual sophistication also provided protection against moral criticism and legal prosecution. Activities that might appear simply depraved when described in isolation could be defended as artistic experimentation or philosophical exploration when presented within appropriate cultural contexts. The elaborate intellectual frameworks that country house hosts developed served both psychological and practical protective functions. The protection was particularly important because country house gatherings often included participants whose careers or social positions made them vulnerable to scandal. Military officers, government officials, and church leaders could attend these gatherings with some confidence that their participation would be interpreted as cultural refinement rather than moral corruption, as long as the appropriate intellectual justifications were maintained. The inclusion of vulnerable participants actually enhanced the transgressive appeal of country house gatherings because it created a sense of shared risk and mutual vulnerability that intensified the bonding experience. When a bishop and a general participated in the same erotic poetry reading or sensual dance performance, they created mutual obligations for discretion and protection that could be valuable for various purposes beyond the immediate social experience. These mutual obligations created informal networks of influence and protection that were often more powerful than the formal membership structures that had characterized libertine societies. Participants didn't need to take explicit oaths or follow formal procedures. Their shared vulnerability and mutual knowledge created bonds that were enforced through practical necessity rather than ceremonial commitment. The informal character of these networks made them much more resilient than organized societies had been. There were no membership lists to be discovered, no formal procedures to be exposed, and no central organization to be destroyed through targeted prosecution. The networks existed as collections of individual relationships and mutual obligations that could survive the elimination of particular venues or participants. The resilience was demonstrated repeatedly during the periodic moral reform campaigns that continued to target elite transgression throughout the later Georgian period. Investigators might succeed in exposing particular gatherings or prosecuting individual participants, but they couldn't eliminate the broader networks of relationships and venues that supported ongoing transgressive activities. The most successful participants learned to diversify their transgressive activities across multiple venues and social networks to minimize their vulnerability to any single exposure or scandal. They might attend masquerade balls for anonymous encounters, participate in country house gatherings for extended transgressive experiences, and maintain private arrangements with individual partners for ongoing intimate relationships. This diversification strategy also allowed participants to tailor their transgressive activities to their specific interests and comfort levels, without being constrained by the particular focus or intensity of any single venue or organization. Someone who enjoyed the theatrical aspects of masquerade culture but was uncomfortable with explicit group activities could participate selectively without having to abandon transgressive socializing entirely. The selective participation model made transgressive culture accessible to a much broader range of people than organized societies had ever attracted. Individuals could experiment with different levels of transgressive behavior without making major commitments or risking their entire social position through association with notorious organizations. This accessibility was particularly important for women, who faced greater social risks from association with transgressive activities, but also had fewer opportunities for sexual and social freedom in conventional society. The distributed character of later Georgian transgressive culture allowed women to participate selectively and strategically while maintaining their respectability in conventional social contexts. The most sophisticated female participants learned to use transgressive social networks to gain access to economic opportunities, political influence, and cultural experiences that would have been impossible through conventional channels. Actresses could use masquerade connections to attract aristocratic patrons, while wealthy widows could use country house networks to build business relationships that enhance their financial independence. The economic dimensions of transgressive social networks became increasingly important as Georgian commercial culture developed. The same informal relationships that facilitated sexual adventure also created opportunities for business partnerships, investment coordination, and commercial intelligence sharing that could be extremely valuable for ambitious participants. The integration of transgressive socializing with commercial networking created hybrid social institutions that served multiple functions simultaneously. A masquerade ball might provide opportunities for sexual encounter, business partnership formation, and political alliance building all within the same evening's activities. Participants could pursue various combinations of objectives depending on their interests and circumstances. This functional integration made transgressive social networks increasingly central to elite economic and political coordination. Individuals who avoided these networks entirely might find themselves excluded from important business opportunities and political developments that were discussed and arranged through transgressive social connections. The professional necessity of participating in transgressive networks created new categories of strategic participants who attended these gatherings primarily for business and political reasons while maintaining careful boundaries around their personal involvement in sexual activities. These strategic participants often became crucial intermediaries who helped maintain the networks while providing connections to more conventional elite institutions. The strategic participants also helped legitimize transgressive social networks by demonstrating that participation didn't necessarily imply moral corruption or personal degeneracy. If respectable businessmen and political figures attended these gatherings for professional reasons, then the networks themselves couldn't be entirely disreputable, even if some participants engaged in questionable personal behavior. This legitimization process was crucial to the long-term survival of transgressive social networks, because it provided protection against moral reform campaigns that might otherwise have succeeded in eliminating them entirely. Critics could attack particular individuals or specific activities, but they couldn't condemn entire networks that included obviously respectable participants who were there for legitimate professional reasons. The professional legitimization also created opportunities for gradual expansion of transgressive cultural influence into mainstream elite institutions. Business practices, political strategies, and cultural innovations that originated in transgressive social networks could spread into conventional institutions through the strategic participants who moved between both worlds. This cultural influence was often subtle and indirect, but it was nonetheless significant in shaping the development of Georgian elite culture. Ideas about individual freedom, social experimentation, and the artificial character of moral constraints that had originated in Libertine societies continued to influence mainstream thought through the distributed networks that replaced organized transgression. The intellectual influence was particularly evident in the artistic and literary production of the later Georgian period. Writers, painters, and musicians who participated in transgressive social networks brought themes, techniques, and aesthetic approaches from those contexts into their public work, creating a gradual shift in cultural sensibilities that made transgressive ideas more acceptable to broader audiences. The aesthetic influence was complemented by philosophical developments that provided intellectual frameworks for understanding and justifying transgressive behavior without requiring explicit rejection of conventional morality. These new philosophical approaches emphasized individual authenticity, natural impulses, and personal fulfillment in ways that could support both conventional and transgressive lifestyle choices. The philosophical sophistication of later transgressive culture represented a significant evolution from the crude hedonism that had characterized some earlier libertine activities. Participants developed nuanced understanding of human psychology, social dynamics, and moral reasoning that allowed them to engage in transgressive behavior while maintaining coherent personal value systems. This intellectual sophistication also made transgressive culture more appealing to educated participants who required meaningful justification for their behavior beyond simple pleasure-seeking. The combination of sensual indulgence with philosophical exploration created experiences that satisfied both physical and intellectual desires in ways that purely conventional or purely transgressive activities could not match. The integration of intellectual and sensual elements became one of the defining characteristics of mature Georgian transgressive culture. The most successful venues and networks provided opportunities for sophisticated conversation, artistic appreciation, and philosophical discussion alongside the sexual and social adventures that were their primary attractions. This integration also distinguished Georgian transgressive culture from cruder forms of elite debauchery that focused exclusively on physical pleasure without intellectual content or cultural sophistication. The Georgian approach created a distinctive cultural form that influenced subsequent developments in British elite culture long after the specific institutions that created it had disappeared. The sophistication and cultural influence of distributed transgressive networks helps explain why they proved so much more durable than the organized libertine societies that preceded them. While libertine societies had operated in explicit opposition to conventional morality and social structures, the distributed networks found ways to coexist with and even enhance conventional elite culture. This coexistence was possible because the distributed approach avoided the revolutionary rhetoric and systematic challenge to established authority that had made libertine societies politically threatening. Instead of claiming moral superiority to conventional society, distributed transgressive culture simply provided alternative outlets for desires and impulses that conventional society couldn't accommodate. The accommodation model proved far more sustainable than the revolutionary approach because it didn't require participants to choose between transgressive and conventional identities. Individuals could maintain their respectability and social position while selectively participating in transgressive activities that enhanced, rather than replaced, their conventional social experiences. This flexibility allowed transgressive culture to survive and even flourish during periods of moral reform and political reaction that might have eliminated more confrontational approaches. The distributed networks could contract during hostile periods and expand during more tolerant times without losing their essential character or participant base. The adaptability of distributed transgressive networks ensured their survival well into the Victorian period, where they continued to operate beneath the surface of official moral respectability. The Victorian emphasis on proper public behaviour actually enhanced the appeal of transgressive alternatives by creating stronger contrasts between public constraint and private freedom. The Victorian survival of transgressive networks also demonstrates the fundamental continuity between Georgian and Victorian elite culture that is often obscured by focusing on official moral rhetoric rather than actual behavioural patterns. While the language and justifications changed, the basic human drives and social needs that had motivated Georgian transgression continued to require outlet and accommodation. Understanding this continuity is crucial to appreciating the full significance of Georgian libertine culture and its distributed successors. These weren't simply historical curiosities or examples of elite decadence, but important experiments in alternative approaches to human fulfillment and social organisation that continued to influence British culture long after their most visible manifestations had been eliminated or transformed. The lasting influence of Georgian transgressive culture can be traced through subsequent developments in British attitudes towards sexuality, individual freedom, artistic expression, and social experimentation. Many ideas and practices that seemed shocking during the Georgian period eventually became accepted parts of mainstream British culture, though often in modified forms that obscured their transgressive origins. The transformation process reveals both the revolutionary potential and the conservative limitations of elite transgressive culture. While these networks succeeded in challenging particular moral restrictions and social conventions, they ultimately operated within and reinforced broader structures of class privilege and gender inequality that limited their transformative impact. The elite character of Georgian transgressive culture meant that its benefits were largely confined to individuals with sufficient wealth and social position to participate safely in transgressive activities. Working-class individuals who engaged in similar behavior faced much harsher consequences, while women of all classes remained vulnerable to exploitation and social condemnation, regardless of their level of participation. These limitations help explain why Georgian transgressive culture ultimately failed to produce the fundamental social transformation that some of its more idealistic participants had envisioned. While it succeeded in creating alternative spaces for personal fulfillment and social experimentation, it didn't challenge the basic structures of power and privilege that determined who could access those alternatives and under what conditions. The failure to achieve broader social transformation also reflects the inherent tensions within elite transgressive culture between individual liberation and collective responsibility. Participants were primarily motivated by personal desires for freedom and fulfillment, rather than commitment to systematic social change, which limited their willingness to challenge structures that supported their own privilege, even when those structures created problems for others. These tensions and limitations don't diminish the historical significance of Georgian transgressive culture, but they do provide important context for understanding its ultimate impact and legacy. The networks and institutions that emerged from Libertine rebellion created new possibilities for human experience and social organization, but they also demonstrated the difficulties of achieving meaningful social change through elite cultural experimentation alone. The broader lessons of Georgian transgressive culture remain relevant to contemporary discussions about individual freedom, social constraint, and the relationship between personal liberation and collective welfare. The Georgian experiments revealed both the potential benefits and the inherent risks of systematic transgression, while demonstrating the complex ways that cultural innovation interacts with existing structures of power and privilege. Perhaps most importantly, the Georgian experience suggests that sustainable approaches to expanding human freedom and fulfillment require careful attention to issues of equity, accessibility, and social responsibility that purely elite cultural movements often neglect. The most successful aspects of Georgian transgressive culture were those that found ways to enhance human flourishing without creating new forms of exploitation or social division. Understanding these successes and failures provides valuable perspective on contemporary efforts to challenge restrictive social conventions and expand opportunities for personal fulfillment. The Georgian pioneers of transgressive culture faced many of the same fundamental challenges that continue to confront anyone seeking to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility, personal authenticity with social obligation, and innovative experimentation with sustainable social organization. Their experiments in alternative approaches to these eternal human dilemmas created a rich legacy of ideas, practices, and institutions that continue to influence British culture long after the scandals and reforms that ended their most visible manifestations. The true measure of their achievement lies not in the specific transgressive activities that attracted contemporary attention, but in their contribution to ongoing human efforts to understand and expand the possibilities for meaningful and fulfilling social existence. The legacy that emerged from this complex web of elite transgression would prove far more enduring and influential than the Libertines themselves could have ever imagined. By the 1780s, what had begun as isolated experiments in aristocratic rebellion had evolved into something that would fundamentally reshape how British society understood the relationship between public virtue and private vice. The most significant transformation wasn't in the elimination of transgressive behavior that would prove impossible, but in the sophisticated methods that evolved for managing and concealing it. The crude exhibitionism of early libertine societies gave way to far more subtle and effective approaches that allowed elite transgression to continue while maintaining the appearance of moral respectability that Victorian society would demand. This evolution created what historians now recognize as one of the most sophisticated systems of organized hypocrisy in Western civilization. The surface culture of moral propriety that dominated public discourse operated alongside an intricate underground network of transgressive activities that served many of the same functions as the libertine societies, but with far greater discretion and political sophistication. The key innovation was the development of what contemporary observers called the double life system. Rather than creating alternative societies that operated in opposition to conventional morality, elite participants learned to maintain simultaneous existences in both respectable and transgressive social worlds. This required remarkable psychological flexibility and social skill, but it provided much greater security and sustainability than previous approaches. The double life system worked because it eliminated the revolutionary rhetoric and systematic challenge to established authority that had made libertine societies politically vulnerable. Instead of claiming moral superiority to conventional society, participants simply treated transgressive activities as private recreational choices that had no bearing on their public responsibilities or social relationships. This compartmentalization allowed individuals to engage in behavior that would have been scandalous if exposed while maintaining genuine commitment to conventional moral standards in their public roles. A judge could participate in elaborate sexual ceremonies on Saturday night and deliver morally stern judgments on Monday morning without experiencing any sense of personal contradiction. The psychological mechanisms that enabled this compartmentalization became increasingly sophisticated as the system matured. Participants developed elaborate mental frameworks that allowed them to separate their transgressive activities from their moral identity, treating private behavior as a form of theatrical performance that didn't reflect their authentic character or values. The theatrical metaphor was particularly important because it provided psychological distance from transgressive activities while maintaining their emotional intensity and appeal. Participants could engage in behavior that violated their stated moral principles by treating it as role-playing or artistic expression rather than authentic personal choice. This theatrical approach was reinforced by the increasingly elaborate staging and costume elements that characterized late Georgian transgressive gatherings. Events would be designed as immersive theatrical productions where participants assumed alternative identities that permitted behavior that would be impossible for their conventional selves. The costume and staging elements weren't just aesthetic choices, they were crucial psychological technologies that enabled the double life system to function effectively. By creating clear boundaries between transgressive performance and conventional identity, these theatrical elements allowed participants to maintain their self-respect and social relationships while engaging in activities that would otherwise create unbearable cognitive dissonance. The most sophisticated participants became skilled method actors who could inhabit their transgressive personas completely during private gatherings while returning seamlessly to their conventional identities for public appearances. This required considerable psychological sophistication and emotional intelligence, but it provided remarkable freedom to explore alternative aspects of human experience without permanent consequences. The acting skills that participants developed for managing their double lives often proved valuable in their conventional careers as well. The ability to inhabit different personas convincingly, to read social dynamics accurately, and to manage complex emotional relationships became assets in political, commercial, and social contexts that had nothing to do with transgressive activities. This practical utility helped justify the time and energy that elite individuals invested in transgressive social networks. Even participants who were primarily motivated by business or political considerations could benefit from the psychological and social skills that transgressive activities help develop. The skill development aspect also attracted participation from individuals who might otherwise have been uncomfortable with explicit transgressive behavior. Professional politicians, military officers, and commercial leaders could justify their involvement as a form of advanced social training that enhanced their effectiveness in conventional roles. This professional justification created yet another layer of legitimacy for transgressive social networks, making them even more resilient to moral criticism and political attack. Critics might condemn particular activities or individual participants, but they couldn't easily challenge networks that provided genuine professional development and social education for their members. The professional legitimacy was enhanced by the increasingly sophisticated organizational structures that evolved to support